Well, hello everyone. This is Brian Kelly from Association Mavens, where you get direct access to some of the foremost thinkers and teachers in the association industry. I'm very pleased to welcome my first return guest today, Jeff Cagna from Principled Innovation. Jeff recently wrote an article for Associations Now titled Trapped in the Past: 5 Challenges for Conventional Thinking. And I was really interested in having Jeff back on the show to discuss this in further detail. Welcome back, Jeff.
Thanks, Brian. It's a pleasure to be back and to be the first return guest. That's quite an honor.
So, Jeff, this article builds on concepts that you've been sharing for a while. Mm-hmm. However, it does offer a slight twist, which I want to talk about. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I know that you originally titled the article 5 Reasons Why Boards Are Killing Association Business Models. Mm-hmm. Can you give us a little backstory on this? Why the reason for the article and kind of the provocative nature of this particular topic?
Sure. Well, I've been, as you know, and I think a lot of your viewers know, I wrote last year about 5 reasons why membership was killing association business models. I wrote some blog posts on that and spoke on that topic quite extensively in 2012. And as I was thinking about other directions I wanted to carry this conversation, I thought, it made good sense to think about boards as a place to do that, because I spend a lot of time working with boards, but also because I serve on boards and have served on boards in the past. So some of the things I write about in the article are things I've observed as an advisor to boards, and other things are things I've observed just in my time serving as a board member over the course of the last 10 years or so. So I thought it would be good to bring this issue forward, because boards obviously play such a huge role in the success or failure of an association, the way that they function. And to be fair, before we get into talking about the reasons, I think it's important for me to say that, to be fair to boards and CEOs and C-suite executives, I think we do have to remember that none of these leaders has really ever had an opportunity to be prepared to take on the responsibility of leading an organization through a business model transformation, especially one that's happening not at their own choice, but one that's happening because of forces beyond their control. So, it's simple to say, oh well, they don't really know, don't really understand what's going on, and I could have included that as a reason that they don't understand the business model, and there's some truth to that. But I think it's important to be fair that this is something that's happening, again, because they need to be prepared to do this, but also I think some of the things that I write about in the article are things that boards have always done, just out of the nature of the way boards work in associations. And so therefore, we need to correct some of those ways of doing the work of governing, sort of leading the organization forward. Our leaders to think differently, develop new habits of mind with regard to operating the business model and thinking about the business model in this environment. So, I think I want to be fair to boards, but also point out that there are things that we have to address.
No, I think this is good, because it's not like you're somebody who's just being a vocal critic on this issue as an outsider. It's you're coming at this from your personal experiences. As you mentioned earlier, just a moment ago, you've been involved with boards. You're actively involved in participating at that level, and so these are your observations that I think come from a really interesting place to be able to start talking about this particular area, versus just somebody who's from the outside that's saying, you shouldn't be doing this or you shouldn't be doing that. Right. So I think that you've got a unique perspective that you're able to bring to this. So with that said, what I want to do is just kind of let's break each one of these down. You've got these 5
Sure.
points, and for myself, I'm still learning as much as I can, obviously, about associations. And this is one area that I've had pretty minimal exposure to. Mm-hmm. So this would be a good chance for me to get my head wrapped around this, but then also for our viewers to get a sense of where you're coming at exactly with these 5 points. So the first one is,
Sure.
You've got it listed as boards operate with a narrow interpretation of fiduciary responsibility. What does that mean, and kind of how is this an area where associations can improve working with their board?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing to keep in mind, just in the spirit of what you just said, for those viewers and for yourself who maybe are not as familiar with the way boards function, boards have fiduciary or financial responsibility for what happens in the organization. There are certain legal duties that go with serving on the board, and those are relating to the effective use of the resources of the organization, and making sure that those resources are being invested in ways that advance the mission and so on. So, but I do think, as what I was writing about in that section of the article is that through a variety of factors, often, it's something that various advisors to boards, boards have a lot of advisors. They have attorneys, they have auditors, they have accountants who provide them with advice on things, and obviously they have a CEO and a senior team often who provide them with advice and making decisions. And I do think that the way that the conversation tends to happen quite frequently at the board level is does encourage a fairly narrow perspective on what fiduciary responsibility means. That boards should be very careful, to the point of almost being risk averse, to the point of being defensive. Associations tend to be pretty conservative in their approach generally, and so I think boards have been encouraged over time to take a more defensive posture, to view risk with a lot of suspicion, and to not want to take on new ways of doing business that might have a negative effect on the organization. So while I understand and certainly agree that there needs to be due diligence and smart ways of approaching things, I think part of the issue from a business model perspective is that if association boards continue to function from a more conservative and defensive posture, it will negate the ability of the organization to bring forward meaningful innovation, and that is going to have very deleterious effects on the existing business model, not to mention that it will make it very difficult to even consider new business model concepts. So again, it's not that fiduciary responsibility is something that we should be ignoring. Far from it. We need to be paying attention to it. But I actually believe that understanding the way the existing business model functions and then being able to have an ongoing conversation about how to build the business model for the future is the ultimate expression of fiduciary responsibility for boards. There are a number of activities that boards engage in that are oversight activities, reviewing the Form 990, which is essentially the tax return for a nonprofit organization, reviewing budgets, reviewing ongoing financial performance, looking at profit and loss statements, reviewing the audit, and so on. These are all very important functions, but again, they're all oversight functions. They're necessary, but they don't really give us the insight and understanding of how the business model itself functions that boards need to have. So I think fiduciary responsibility for boards is best expressed by having boards understand and talk about the existing business model and then think with the CEO, the C-suite executives, and other contributors about how that business model needs to adapt and shift for the future. That to me is the most important thing. So rather than narrowing fiduciary responsibility to just the oversight function, just the more conservative and defensive posture of conserving, maintaining resources, I think they need to be more expansive in their approach by really making the business model, putting it front and center in the conversation. And toward that end, one of the things I recommend there's an online companion to the article that we're talking about. The article appears in Associations Now and is also online. And then there's a web extra that also appears on the ASAE, on the Associations Now website. One of the suggestions that I make is that boards institute a policy of spending 20% of their time talking about the business model. So this is sort of a riff off of the very famous 20% time policy that Google has adopted, and other companies have adopted similar policies. Right. And I thought, I actually was sitting with a client a few years ago with their board, listening to their board talk, and I must have gotten really bored by the conversation, no pun intended there, because I started writing a blog post during this board meeting, which was about this topic, which was, wouldn't it be interesting if boards applied a 20% policy to their own discussion of innovation? And so I sort of morphed that a little bit to say, let's have boards adopt a 20% policy where they spend 20% of their overall time each year, not just at any one meeting, but over the course of a year, really looking in depth at the existing business model and how that business model needs to adapt for the new environment. So I think that's a really critical aspect of this, is to have boards think about fiduciary responsibility in business model terms, not purely in oversight terms.
Yeah, so it seems like if the association's on a journey, The board is usually typically focused on steering us clear of different obstacles or taking this path or this part, another direction. But instead, we're talking about stepping back and looking further ahead to be thinking about what types of things proactively should we be focusing on as an association, and how the board can contribute to that direction. So I think it's pretty interesting where it's getting away from that narrow focus and thinking a little bit broader, or at least providing an opportunity to think beyond just like, are we hitting our financial numbers that we need to be? Are we minimizing risk? All of those different things.
Right.
So
yeah, I think it's really about making a tangible connection between strategy and business model. Boards often talk about strategy, which is really about, what is the game we want to play as an organization? What is the value that we think we can create? But the business model is really about how do you go about doing that? So if the strategy is what game do we want to play, the business model is how will you play that game to be successful? And as part of fiduciary responsibility, strategy really does tie into how we allocate resources in an organization. So business model ties into whether we're effectively using those resources to accomplish the outcomes we have in mind. That to me is really where fiduciary responsibility lives. Again, the oversight component is absolutely essential, and I'm not arguing against it. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that. I think it's as long as there are governments interested in what we are doing, there will always be oversight activities that boards need to perform. We need to review those documents and make sure we're asking the right questions of the management of the organization. At the same time, that as someone who serves as a fiduciary, I just don't think that that's enough for us to say we are doing our jobs. That if I can't really understand and talk about the business model and understand what the challenges are and recognize the issues that it's likely to confront, that's already confronting and likely to confront going forward, then I don't really feel like I'm discharging my fiduciary responsibility. This is a very critical aspect of the way boards approach their work, I think, and it's something that we definitely want to encourage boards to take a more expansive view of the connection among strategy, business model, and fiduciary responsibility, rather than limiting it, keeping it fairly narrow to just look at these documents and give us your blessing, in effect, that we're doing a good job. That's we want that, and we clearly need that with our staff partners, but it needs to go beyond that.
Yeah, great. So the next one that you've got is boards have been slow to embrace the shifting dynamics of new value creation. What does that mean?
Well, I think that we all know that we're operating in an environment now where new value is being created more on the basis of technology platforms. We're seeing huge adoption of mobile and social technologies, cloud computing, a big shift towards the importance of data, and so on and so on and so on. And we don't need to recount the entire details of that because I think we're all pretty familiar with that. But I do think that boards often do not think in those terms. They often do not recognize the fact that as the world is shifting towards the adoption of those technologies, it means that value is being created in new and different ways. Even if on some level they might intuitively get it because they're using an iPad or they're working off of a smartphone or something like that, they haven't necessarily in every case made a complete transition from, okay, this is what's happening in the world at large, we need to be adopting this within our organization, or in the way we face our customers, our stakeholders, our members, and so on. And I think that that is in part because our boards do not always have people on the board who are technology savvy people. For decades we have said, we really need to recruit people to serve on boards who have a background in financial matters, who have a background in legal matters, who have a background in some of these issues that we've already been talking about that are really critical to what boards do. And I think that at least as important as having people with financial acumen or business savvy or legal experience or other areas that we might value, we need to start identifying people who have technology savvy and experience to serve on boards, because they're the ones who are going to help drive the conversation to say, look, we need to be using the technology platforms of today and tomorrow to create value for our stakeholders, because that's what they want, that's what our stakeholders want, but it's also in our best interest because it is an appreciating resource when we do that. We develop more from building a technology platform than we give up. It reduces our costs, but it increases our ability to serve our stakeholders. So while associations continue to invest in activities that often do not reflect where the stakeholders of the future would like the conversation to go, it means that they're depriving the opportunity of the association to really build out that platform that's going to enable them to have long-term future success. I often talk about the concept of thick value, which is value that is meaningful and purposeful, and created in a way that is consistent with purpose. But I also think we have to talk about smart value. And one of the things that technology allows us to do is create smarter value by understanding the actual use that our stakeholders, are pursuing with technology. We get actual data on how they use it when we use technology, and I think that's really important to understand. So, I think one of the ways that we can encourage that way of thinking at the board level is, in fact, by having boards use these technologies in the way they govern the organization. Now, there's a school of thought in the association world now that suggests that the reason why associations may want to shift to using more electronic resources for boards, and quite a few associations have already done this. They've moved towards, PDFs rather than board books. Part of the rationale, the feeling goes, is that, well, it's a cost savings for the association to not have to print a board book. It's a green strategy. You're not printing as many pages of paper. It's not as wasteful, and so on and so forth. And I think those are useful benefits. But I really believe the reason why we need our boards to function more digitally, if you will, to govern in a more digital way, is that it's very hard to have a group that is thinking in a fairly linear paper-based way to think in a non-linear technology-based way. It's hard to give someone a 3-ring binder and say to them, now we want you to think more expansively about technology. And there are some CEOs who I think, take the position, that it's more of an old school view that, we're still going to print these 3-ring binders. I don't think of it as old school. I think of it as antiquated. I think we really need to challenge our boards to govern in a way that does take full advantage of digital tools, so they can understand that these digital tools play a critical role in the future success of our organizations, and not hamstring them by continuing to encourage a mindset that is very linear and very analog in a world that is increasingly very digital. And I think that's a very important transition we have to make.
So we talked about basically bringing somebody onto the board that has they're either a technologist or they're tech savvy, to bring that perspective.
Yeah.
And we also talked about ways that the board as a whole can start using technology in a way that's a little bit more relevant to what's happening in our society today. Is there anything else that boards can do with this particular area to embrace these so-called new dynamics of value creation?
Well, I think there is, and I think it goes back. I think there's a couple of different things that I would just quickly suggest. I think one is, in Associations Unorthodox, my ebook that we spoke about in my last interview with you, one of the suggestions that I make is the idea of associations' crowdsourcing strategy. So I think the crowdsourcing of strategy, which is almost by definition something that's going to be done on a technology-based platform, would really challenge association boards to think differently about the way strategic conversation occurs, and especially if some of those board members participate in it. I think that's a great opportunity for them to see how technology-mediated conversation can occur. I think a related point is that they can certainly pay more attention to the way conversations unfold via various social platforms, especially platforms like Twitter and others that have a more real-time kind of feel to them, and understanding how stakeholders are talking about things. But I think just generally, it would be really helpful, I think at a very simple level, if boards had the opportunity to interact with more of their stakeholders of the future, the people in the organization. That's not, I should say that stakeholders of the future is not necessarily defined by what age you are. It's not everyone under the age of 30. It certainly includes those people, but it can include others as well, and even people who are much older than that, because one of the defining characteristics of that group is, do you sort of see yourself in a more digital and connected life? And is that part of who you are and what you do? And so, and do you sort of operate, your life and career in that way? So I think just having the opportunity to interact with more stakeholders who do sort of see themselves through that lens, I think would be really beneficial for boards, because that would give them kind of a crash course in understanding, well, look, the reasons why I joined this association decades ago are likely to be different than the reasons why stakeholders of today are joining the association, and I need to better understand their rationale for this, and then bring that conversation to the table and recognize that as much as I may value things that are of a certain type, and that might be okay, our stakeholders of the future value different things because they have different opportunities as well as different pressures, and so our ways of connecting with them have to reflect what they're facing rather than what I believe makes the most sense because of my past experience.
Great. Well, let's talk a little bit about risk. The third point that you make is that boards choose investment risk over innovation risk.
Right.
Talk a little bit about the differences between those two and why this is an important piece to understand.
Well, I think from a from a sort of board practice perspective, I mean, clearly one of the things we want boards to be doing is thinking about the future and making sure there are resources for the future of the organization, right? Which is why boards, it's considered, effective practice for boards to be working with their CEOs and investment advisors to build a portfolio of actual market investments, stocks and bonds and whatnot, whatever the investment policy of the organization might be, but really investing some, reserves, so that there are dollars, for the future. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing that. My point in this part of the article is to simply say that oftentimes boards make the decision to put dollars into those investments over the idea of putting dollars into investments in people who have ideas that could actually advance the organization. Not every board member has a full understanding of the downside risk of every investment that's coming forward. And I don't pretend to have unique insight on this because I'm certainly not an investment expert by any stretch of the imagination. I certainly listen to what investment advisors say and what other board members who have a lot more experience will say in the various situations that I've been in, that place as a director. That having been said, I also recognize that there is an inherent risk in certain kinds of investments, that there are questions about that, and we want to look at how we manage those risks. But I also want to make sure that we're not putting all of our resources essentially at the mercy of markets that we don't control. We can do all the right things with an investment policy by establishing the parameters in which we would choose to invest, the kinds of instruments in which we would choose to invest, and even be very careful around how much money is allocated to them and so on and so forth, and be very mindful of that process. But we still can't control the markets. We still cannot control ultimately whether stock markets or bond markets go up or down. That's far beyond our control. What we have a much greater opportunity to influence as a board is being able to say, we've got people who are part of this organization who have an idea, and that idea is worth taking a look at, and we want to make an investment in them and their idea to see whether that has any upside potential. So we may not be able to control that outcome, but we can certainly have much greater influence over it than we do over the continue as boards to choose the investment risk because it's what we're supposed to do over the innovation risk. And my concern is that sometimes these dollars in reserves are referred to just colloquially as a rainy day fund, which may or may not be the best description, but what I can say is for a lot of associations it is raining. And if it's not raining now, it's going to be raining soon, and for some associations it's a deluge. So my question would be, when are we actually going to start being more proactive in using the dollars that we have invested for the future, these so-called rainy day funds, into actually building for the future in the innovation that needs to happen? I mean, if it's raining, the logical response is to go to the umbrella stand and pull out the umbrella and open it up. And it seems to me that we need to be doing that. I don't want to torture this metaphor too much, but we need to be doing that now by taking action to say, not emptying our reserves, but being strategic in our approach and saying, look, we have reserves for a reason, and that's so that we can invest in the future. And and to be fair, there are organizations that are doing this. So I don't want to cast everyone in the same light or paint every organization with the same brush. But I do think that there's a fundamental question that we need to grapple with, which is, are we going forward, put more of our investment dollars into people and their ideas, or more investment dollars into markets that, again, are completely, more or less, beyond our control?
Yeah, I recently saw a TED talk by Dan Pallotta talking about this very similar approach, and more broadly, he talks about in just the nonprofit sector, and some of the notions of how we've been focused on making sure that we manage risk financially in an appropriate manner, but it's like there's a lot of ways that we can apply those funds in ways to fuel innovation, to help us drive forward as an organization, and to tackle a lot of the challenges that we're facing, whether it's in our professional or trade organization, or if it's for a cause such as breast cancer, et cetera. It takes a pretty big shift to realize that there's an opportunity there. And I think this is a really good point as well that you've got here.
And I think I'm familiar, a little bit with Dan's work, and I think it is also an issue just more broadly in the nonprofit sector for a couple of reasons. One, there is an incentive system that's been set up in the nonprofit sector about how nonprofits are evaluated based on their performance, and I think Dan talks about this. And some of the incentives that are there are actually perverse incentives because they do not reward organizations for making investments in capacity. Those investments are treated as costs, and so when a nonprofit organization puts too much money towards what watchdog groups view as costs, it undermines their rating. The other issue is that I think is challenging for all nonprofits, including associations, is that making investments, like if an organization makes an investment in the market and the market goes down, it's easily explained, right? You can say, well, look, we made investments, we have a policy, we're doing it smartly, we're not doing it willy-nilly, we're trying to approach it with some intelligence, but yet the market still went down. People understand that. Can be harder to explain to a donor, right, or to a member or to other stakeholders, well, we made an investment in an idea and the idea didn't pan out. And people will say, well, why did you do that, right? Even though it's exactly the same thing, making an investment in an idea that doesn't pan out is the same thing as making an investment in a financial vehicle that doesn't perform. But the difference is that people can understand the markets go down because you can't control them. People always, on some level, some people, not all people, but some donors, some members, some stakeholders will question, why would you make investments in those half-baked, crazy ideas that people have when you could have put that money into an investment vehicle and grown it for the future? Our feelings about them, our sort of psychology around those two ideas is very different. The psychology of investment in the market is that it will grow over time no matter what. Even though there'll be temporary ups and downs, over time it'll grow. It feels so much more risky to put money into someone's idea because it feels like an all or nothing bet, even though it rarely is, and even though there are other ways to mitigate that risk. So there's a lot of psychology, I think, embedded in this concern, but I think it comes fundamentally back to we have been encouraged as directors, as members of boards, to make investments in financial markets because that's the right thing to do, and we are therefore on some level, perhaps even tacitly, sometimes and sometimes even explicitly discouraged from putting dollars into innovation investments because they feel riskier than the marketplace. And I think that's kind of backwards, actually.
Yeah, I mean, one more thing on this, and we'll move to the next point. I think it's interesting because these concepts are kind of where boards seem to be at right now, is something that was appropriate at a certain point in time. And now we're in a new era, and we're facing new challenges, and this shift in thinking and really analyzing the psychology behind what this actually means, I think it is really kind of the key to unlocking this shift towards really feeling comfortable with taking that risk on innovation.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question, that what's happened over the course of the last 20 years or so has very much shifted all of the dynamics of this environment, and I do think that human nature is quite durable, and so even though the environment is different, human nature often remains quite constant. And so, and again, people serve on boards, and many people have served on multiple boards. And so when I spoke earlier about the idea of developing new habits of mind, I think this is an area where a new habit of mind is required of boards of directors, and also, I would say, of CEOs and chief financial officers and those who are involved in the financial aspect of the organization and the investment aspect of the organization, investment committees, and finance committees and treasurers and investment advisors and accountants and auditors, all of the people who are involved in the financial aspects of the association, I think need to take a more balanced approach by saying, yes, we have to continue to put dollars aside for the future. There's nothing wrong with that, and it's necessary to our future vitality to have those dollars. But we should not necessarily say, well, you know what, we're going to choose that almost entirely or exclusively over the idea that we can invest in ideas that have the potential to move us forward in very exciting ways. And again, there are mechanisms and ways of addressing that. And in fact, one of the mechanisms that I write about in the online extra for this article is the idea that a board can establish its own innovation agenda, that it can craft an innovation agenda that, ties into the ideas that are generated by stakeholders of the organization through a crowdsourced strategy process or through other means. They can work with staff to develop it and essentially establish certain innovation priorities that they would like the organization to pursue. And functioning as investors, they can give their imprimatur to those innovation priorities through an innovation agenda that can be widely circulated in the organization to say, these are the areas where we see opportunities for innovation, and we'd love to get your ideas in these areas, and we're prepared to make some investments in those ideas. And again, those investments do not have to be big dollar investments. I mean, if we had more time here, I could give you long stories about organizations that made big all or nothing bets on things that seemed to be the right thing to do at the time that didn't pan out, and yet what I'm really advocating is that organizations can make a lot of small bets on a lot of different ideas and establish an innovation portfolio just as surely as they can have an investment portfolio, and that they can manage that portfolio based on levels of risk, based on maturity dates, which are ideas that are going to come to fruition maybe sooner rather than others. The same principles that we apply to the investment in financial vehicles can be applied to the investment in innovation concepts and building for the future. We just have to be willing, from a psychology perspective and from a leadership perspective, to do that, and I think that's going to be the challenge.
Yeah, really interesting. Okay, so your fourth point is no surprise, and based on our past interview and obviously
Sure.
information that you've shared through multiple channels. So let's just talk about it for 2 minutes for those that may not be familiar with it. But you talk about boards really adhering to this membership ideology. So just very briefly, talk about what that means and the significance here in this discussion.
Well, I think I would just pick up briefly on what I said a moment ago from not understanding the new dynamics of value creation. I think that again the issue that we sort of ended with there is the stakeholders of the past joined associations for very different reasons, I think, than the stakeholders of the future. The stakeholders of the past found that the things that they needed, information, networking, learning, were quite scarce at the time that they joined 25, 30 or more years ago. A very different environment. And so over the course of the 25 or 30 or more years that people have been involved in their organizations, they have been immersed in a membership experience that for them contained considerable richness and considerable power. In some cases, they met lifelong friends. They did business with those people. They've not only seen people at association meetings, but they've traveled with them. They know each other very well. And part of what's happened is over that time, these people have made their way up to the board of directors. So it's logical that by the time someone arrives at the board of directors after 25 or 30 years of being a member of the organization, that they are passionately committed to the idea of membership as the defining premise of the association's business model. But as we have discussed, and as I've written extensively and mentioned in this interview, the 5 reasons why membership is killing association business models, the economics of membership have changed. The rationale for why someone should join the organization has changed. The stakeholders of the future have abundant access to all the things that associations have already provided without having to join the association. There's abundant access to information, abundant access to networking, abundant access to learning, as well as other benefits, if you will, other forms of value. So for the stakeholders of the future, the membership experience is not necessarily as immersive and powerful as it has been for the stakeholders of the past, who are now often serving in leadership roles. So the issue for me is boards cannot allow their passionate borderline ideological commitment to the importance of membership to be the thing that derails the association's business model today and going forward. There has to be a much more flexible way of looking at the business model conversation that doesn't require us to define every aspect of the future business model or the current business model in terms of membership. And as long as that ideology is in place, that it's all about membership all the time, then it's going to be very, very difficult for boards to express their fiduciary responsibility by saying, you know what, we need to look beyond membership to recognize the fact that the stakeholders of the future may not necessarily want that. I mean, the question I think we have to be asking at all times from the point of view of the stakeholders of the future is, why do I want this relationship? Right? Why do I need this relationship? And if we can't come up with a good answer other than, well, you can join and be a member, then I think it's going to be very hard for us to make a case to stakeholders who have alternatives in a way that the stakeholders of the past, including today's leaders, did not have. And I think that's a major shift that boards have to grapple with on a very personal level, very individual level, as well as on a collective level as a decision-making group.
Oh, great, well said. And I think, from someone who's probably of this newer generation and coming to associations, it makes sense to me. And I think the point that you make about those who have kind of risen through the ranks over the last 2 or 3 decades, it's easy to, it's no fault. It's just part of that process that they've gone through. And it takes an outside perspective, or at least a shift in focus or a shift in perspective, to really see this is how things are, and we've got to make that adjustment to allow for this.
Yeah, I think that's really important. It's a mindset shift, and you're right. It's not. There's no blame being placed here. I mean, it's a function of the way that this often happens in organizations. People get committed to a way of seeing things because they have seen it that way for so long. And again, it's not a criticism. It's as I write in the article, some of the things that are killing association business models that boards do are things that they do perhaps without even realizing it. And I think that this may be one of those things. There's that very famous quote that I often say that's attributed to Marshall McLuhan, which is, "I don't know who invented water, but it probably wasn't a fish." And when you are so immersed in your context, in the way that board members of membership associations are immersed in the concept of membership, it can be very hard to get outside of that and say, you know what, the way we look at membership, the way we define membership, the way we think about membership in 2013 is very different from the way we would talk and think and discuss and view membership in 1973. Right. That 40 years ago or 1983, 30 years ago, our mindset around this was very different than it is today. We need to understand that the stakeholders of the future will continue to look at this through a different lens and adapt our business models to that, rather than trying to do what I think some organizations think they can do, which is fix the stakeholders of the future to get it to see it our way or their way, and I don't think that's going to work.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got just a few minutes left. I want to touch on this fifth and final point that you've got in the article, and it's boards prefer politics to profitability. Mm-hmm. What does this mean?
Well, as I read in the article, I think it manifests itself in different ways. I mean, one way that it manifests itself is through organizations that conduct competitive elections for board service, which I think is in many ways antithetical to the way we need boards to function. When people feel like they, and again, this is not a universal reality, but I think it does exist in a lot of organizations that I've seen. When people are elected to a board by constituency, they feel their loyalty to the constituency sometimes, frequently. And when you serve on a board, you can't really maintain a loyalty to a constituency. You have to maintain a loyalty to the organization as a whole. So competitive elections often have a negative effect on building boards that can see the big picture, because everyone's coming at it from their own unique perspective. I think the other problem too is that we often, competitive elections often deprive associations of getting really good people to serve on their boards, because the people who run for office are often the ones who are politically popular or well-connected, not necessarily the people who are best equipped to serve in governing roles. And sometimes when people run for things and lose, it sours them on the entire experience for the future, so you'll never get them involved. I mean, it is a very public rebuke when someone runs for an elected office on a board and a fairly small number of people cast votes for that, but you still lose. I mean, that's a hard lesson to take. So that's one focus, or one possibility. The other, another area is that boards often, associations often focus on advocacy, and advocacy is a very, very hard activity to monetize, and yet it becomes a very important part of the way the association operates. So it has a kind of again, a potentially negative effect on the business model unless the association can come up with a way to monetize that or find other ways to subsidize it that gives them the possibility of driving towards profitability. And a lot of organizations are struggling with this. But I think the main issue here is, and I think it's quite natural that when people join a board of directors, that people are thinking about, well, I think it'd be really fun someday to be the chair of this board, right? Or to be in some kind of more influential position within the board, to sort of work your way through the chairs, is the phrase that people often use. And the problem that I see with that is that it often leads to people making decisions about how they're going to handle issues on the basis of politics, what's most politically expedient, rather than what's in the best interest of the organization, what's going to drive the business model toward profitability. And I think that's a real issue for a lot of organizations. And sometimes those politics are quite overt. You will see them in the way people interact with one another. You'll see the different defined camps, the people who are behind one person who might be running for chairman or president in a year or two, and the person over here who might be running for chairman or president in a year or two, especially if there's a competitive election, or who might be positioning themselves to be selected to serve in that role if it's not a competitive election. So sometimes they're overt, sometimes they're quite subtle, but I think the politics are there. I mean, whenever you have two or more people involved in a situation where there's conflict to be managed in order to get something done, there's politics. Mm-hmm. And so the politics often overwhelm the ability of the association to drive towards the more important outcome for the organization as a whole, which is, do we have a sustainable business model that gives us at least the possibility of becoming profitable, right away or in the near term? And so I think we have to really demand that boards set aside the politics, which can sometimes be extremely petty, and focus less on their own self-interest, and focus a lot more on the broader interest of how do we build a stronger organization. Because in the end, if it's all about a quest for power, then that quest for power will destroy the organization on some level. May not happen right away. It may take years for it to happen, but it will happen. If the quest for profitability is what people focus on, then everyone will have more power. Everyone will feel more capable and feel more confident because they will have done the best thing they can do for the organization, which is build a stronger organization that they can leave to their successors. And I really think that the more that we can focus boards on this overarching goal of building organizations that are purposeful and profitable, we'll have a lot more success than the continued sort of behind the scenes machinations for trying to jockey for position within the board hierarchy and trying to figure out who's in the in crowd and who's in the out crowd. I think that has nothing but negative consequences for our associations today and going forward.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely seems like politics are always going to be there, but
no question.
Minimizing the importance that politics plays and really getting back to a focus on why are we here, why are we serving, what can we contribute to this organization that's going to help propel the organization forward, and as you say, make it profitable. It seems like it's a shift in focus, or the mindset, making a slight adjustment to recognize politics are going to be here. Mm-hmm. And it's just part of how this process goes, but we've got to minimize it and elevate our focus in a different way to achieve essentially what we're here to achieve.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, and I think it's not useful for any of us to be naive about the idea that we're going to eliminate the politics from these groups. So I think you're absolutely right about that. I think they're there. Like I said, when you put two or three people, put two or more people in a group where decisions have to be made, and there's conflict in that, there's going to be politics. So that's by definition, it's going to be there. But you're right. It's how do we build into board thinking across all of these 5 reasons, ways of approaching their work that minimize the negative influences of politics, and get them to be focused on the most important legal and financial and strategic responsibilities that they have. And part of what I write about and talk about is this idea of building the strategic legitimacy of boards. And if boards, I think, focus on their strategic legitimacy, which is very simply put, recognizing the reality of what's happening around their organizations, understanding how that reality is affecting the stakeholders of the future who are going to be the backbone of the organization if there's going to be one, and then committing to accelerate the rate of internal progress toward achieving better outcomes for those stakeholders. If boards can focus on that, building strategic legitimacy, then the politics become much less relevant, because the board as a whole will be seen as getting it, because fundamentally that's what it comes down to. The stakeholders of the future are asking themselves, do I need this relationship? And part of answering that question is, does the board get it? Do they understand how what's happening around the organization, around this profession or industry, is going to affect me, is already affecting me? It's not so much a what's in it for me thing, it's does the association really understand it? Do those senior leaders get it? Do they see it? And will they take action to address it to the best of their ability, right? And I think strategic legitimacy, to me, is the antidote to the politics, because it would force boards to focus on something larger than their own political ambitions, to focus on some broader outcome that is more significant for the stakeholders they say they want to serve. Now we have to encourage them to actually live up to that way of thinking. So yeah, the politics aren't going away, but we have to find ways to minimize their negative effect on the outcomes for the association.
Well, it's a great note to end this discussion on, Jeff. So thanks so much for coming back here and doing this interview, and thanks to everybody for watching. If you'd like this interview, be sure to sign up today in the upper right-hand corner of the website to be updated via email when new interviews are posted. Also, be sure to follow @BrianKellyNow on Twitter to stay on top of all things Association Mavens related. And lastly, if you think a colleague or friend would benefit from this interview or would find it helpful, make sure you send them a link right now. So go ahead and do that. Thanks again for watching, and I look forward to bringing you more fantastic interviews just like this one. Bye-bye.